When I think of some of the top classic rock bands of the 70s, I immediately think of stadium-filling bands like Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd, of course, The Who, the Rolling Stones, Genesis. Then you got heavy hitters like, yes, Rush, Deep Purple, Black Sabbath, Queen, AC/DC. None of them hailing from the U.S., though. So it got me to thinking, who are some of the top American classic rock bands of the 70s? Who would you put on your list? No right or wrong answers here, so be sure to comment below who your favorites are. My top 30 American classic rock bands of the 70s coming up next on Music Meanderings. Today on Music Meanderings, we're looking at the top 30 classic rock bands on my list for the 70s. Alphabetical order, first one up, Aerosmith. Lots of great albums through the 70s. Aerosmith, Get Your Wings, Toys in the Attic, Rocks, Draw the Line, even Night in the Ruts from 1979. Aerosmith, one of the top bands, followed by the Allman Brothers Band. Their legendary At Fillmore East came out in 1971. By many believed to be the best Southern rock band. Brothers and Sisters, Eat a Peach, many classics from the Allman Brothers in the 70s. Again, doing these in alphabetical order. Next up, classic rock bands of the 70s. Blue Oyster Cult. They had the first three called the Black and White albums because they were black and white covers. And, of course, Agents of Fortune also came in the 70s, the album that included Godzilla, Spectres, and legendary concert performances. Speaking of which, next up, Bob Seger and the Silver Bullet Band. A legendary concert performance really broke them in 1976 as recorded on Live Bullet. Also, Night Moves, Stranger in Town, both released in the 70s as well for Bob Seger and the Silver Bullet Band. Next up, this might make a lot of people's list for top bands in the 70s, even though they only had two albums come out in the 70s. 1976, their debut, Boston, followed up 2 years later, 1978, Don't Look Back. Boston on my top 30 list of classic rock bands from the 70s. Little argument here, Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band. Of course, they had their start in the 70s. 1973 was the first Bruce Springsteen album, Greetings from Asbury Park, New Jersey. Also had The Wild, the Innocent, E Street Shuffle, Born to Run, Darkness on the Edge of Town. Next up, Cheap Trick. One of my favorite bands, and I think one of the top 30 classic rock bands of the 70s. Had that trilogy of albums before they released at Budokan, which really broke them in 1978, backing up the release of Heaven Tonight, their fourth album. Also Dream Police. Chicago, released in Chicago 1 through 13. Also the album that went away from that custom, just called Hot Streets in 1979. Chicago, performing lots and recording a lot in the 70s. One of the classic rock bands on my list. Doobie Brothers next up. And they started in 1971 with their first album, followed by Tola Street, The Captain of Me, What Were Once Vices, Stampede, Taking It to the Streets, Living on the Fault Line, which entered the Michael McDonald years, Minute by Minute. Doobie Brothers, definitely one of the top 30, followed by the Eagles. Again, we're doing these in alphabetical order. And, of course, the Eagles released classics like their first one, Desperado, On the Border, One of These Nights, Hotel California, and The Long Run, all from the Eagles in the 1970s. And three albums from this band in the 70s, still going, although no original members in the lineup now. Talking about Foreigner, 1977's Monster debut, followed by Double Vision in 1978, and their third album, really good as well, Head Games, which came out in 1979. Grand Funk makes my list of top 30 classic rock bands of the 70s. Just classics like Closer to Home, their live album, Survival, E Pluribus Funk. We're an American band, of course. Too many to mention here in the time that we have, but Grand Funk, definitely one of the top 30 classic rock bands. Grateful Dead, Working Man's Dead, American Beauty, Europe 72, the great live album from the Mars Hotel, Blues for Allah, Terrapin Station, Shakedown Street, and of course their legendary concerts, Grateful Dead, top 30 classic rock band of the 70s. And Heart arrived on the scene 1975 with Dreamboat Annie, followed by Magazine, Little Queen, Dog and Butterfly. One of my favorite Heart albums, all released in the 70s for classic rockers. Heart on my list of top 30 classic rock bands of the 70s. Again, in alphabetical order, and we're up to J. Got to include the Jay Giles Band. The Morning After, live Full House. Really, they were known for their live performances and live albums like Live Full House and also Blow Your Face Out. Jay Giles Band on the list, followed by Journey. Their first three albums, of course, had more of a progressive rock sound to them, closer to Santana than what Journey would become by 1978 with the addition of Steve Perry and Infinity and Evolution. Followed that in 1979. Perhaps one of the best, if not the very best, progressive rock band from the States, and that is Kansas, with their debut, Song for America, Mask, then the breakthrough Leftover, Point of No Return, Monolith, all from the 70s for Kansas. We're looking at the top American rock bands of the 70s. Kiss on that list, of course, with their debut, Hotter Than Hell, Dressed to Kill, and then they really broke it open with Alive, and Alive 2 also came out in the 70s, as did Rock and Roll Over, Love Gun, and Dynasty. Lynyrd Skynyrd, classic Southern rockers, pronounced Lynyrd Skynyrd, their first one, which arrived in 73, Second Helping 74, Nothing Fancy 75, Give Me Back My Bullets, the live One More from the Road, and Street Survivors, which came in 1977. Punk rockers, the Ramones, making their mark, CBGBs in New York City and then around the world. And they arrived on the scene with their first album, 1976, followed by 77's Leave Home, Rocket to Russia, and Road to Ruin. The Ramones on that American top 30 classic rock band list. REO Speedwagon. Hard to believe their first album came out all the way back in 71. Of course, lots of lineup changes, and then they had the live album, You Get What You Play For, and You Can Tune a Piano. 9 Lives, all from the 70s before they really broke it big in the 80s with High Infidelity. Santana's up next with Abraxas, Santana 3, Amigos, Festival, Moonflower, just classic stuff from Santana, and of course those epic concert performances in the 70s. Santana, Steely Dan, Can't Buy a Thrill, Countdown to Ecstasy, Pretzel Logic, Katie Live, The Royal Scam, Asia, all from the 70s for studio band Steely Dan. As we look at the top classic rock American bands from the 70s, Steve Miller on that list, Steve Miller Band with The Joker, Fly Like an Eagle, Book of Dreams, and of course his greatest hits album that everybody seemed to own. Steve Miller Band, one of the top classic rock bands of the 70s. And next up, one of my favorites, that is Styx. You know, I got into Styx early on with their first albums. I had those on cassette. That dates it. Styx 2, Serpent is Rising, Man of Miracles, Equinox, one of my favorite Styx albums, Crystal Ball, The Grand Illusion, Pieces of Eight, and Cornerstone, all released by Styx in the 70s. Ted Nugent, well, I guess you could say a solo performer, but he had a band that performed with him. Ted Nugent, his first solo album, 75, Free for All, which even featured Meatloaf on some vocals, Cat Scratch Fever, Weekend Warriors, and State of Shock, all released in the 70s for Ted Nugent. The Cars, only 2 albums to their credit in the 70s, but they were great ones. Some people might consider them more an 80s band, but I have them on this list of my top 30 classic rock bands of the 70s with their their debut in 78 and Candy-O in 1979. Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, 1976. You know, I thought they went back further than that, but that was their debut album, followed by You're Gonna Get It, and, of course, the big breakthrough for Tom Petty, Damn the Torpedoes, which arrived in 1979. And we are to the letter V, of course, Van Halen. Again, another band with only 2 albums released in the 70s, but they were really trendsetters. 1978, followed by Van Halen 2 in 1979. And they were an opening act at first, but nobody wanted to play after Van Halen. And finally, zztop. zztop's first album, 1971, Rio Grande Mud, came in 72, followed by Trace Hombres in 1973, Fandango, which was half studio and half live in 75, and Tejas and Tequila. zztop, definitely one of the top 30 classic rock American bands of the 70s. Well, there you have it. My list in alphabetical order, my top 30 American classic rock bands of the 70s. Now, some honorable mentions that didn't quite make my list, but could have. Punk pioneers, the Stooges, you know, Iggy Pop's band. Also, new wave CBGB bands like the Talking Heads and Blondie. I kind of associate them more with the 80s, though. Fleetwood Mac, now, they were originally a British band, even though the addition of Americans Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks changed their sound and made them a huge band in the 70s. Now, bands like Beach Boys, Creedence Clearwater Revival, Sly and Family Stone, still popular in the 70s, but they didn't make my list because most of their recorded output they're remembered for came out in the 60s. Now, I'm sure you can think of ones you would include that didn't make my list. Comment and subscribe to the channel below. No right or wrong answers here. Let's just have a good time with this, and thanks for watching Music Meanderings.